Hey everybody, Nolan here, and what I'd like to talk to you about in this video is weed water. What is this stuff? Well, it's fertilizer. It's fertilizer that I produce. In that sense, it's man-made, but it's made from natural ingredients that I collect and gather from my own little postage stamp size property. I haven't bought or applied synthetic fertilizers to my garden or yard in 7 or 8 years. And yet on my own property, I'm able to grow about 400 pounds of food a year if I'm being lazy, or maybe 600 to 700 if I really put my back into it. And weed water is how I fill the gaps in my nutrient needs. So the nutrient requirements that maybe I'm not quite able to meet by composting or with the nutrients that are just present in the soil, I fill those gaps with weed water. Now there's a lot of reasons why you might not want to purchase or use synthetic fertilizer on your property. It is bad for the environment. It produces a lot of greenhouse gases in the production of synthetic fertilizers. It's also bad for waterways. When runoff fertilizer goes into waterways, it's bad for aquatic life. It's expensive. It does add up over time. And even though synthetic fertilizer can boost the yield of crops, it probably makes them less healthy. It's kind of like junk food. It supplies those immediate, quick shot of nutrients, but it doesn't really do much for the soil. In fact, application of synthetic fertilizers can actually degrade the quality of your garden's soil. And maybe most importantly for me, when you go out and buy fertilizer, whether it's synthetic or some kind of, natural stuff, it's really relying on somebody else for your nutrient needs. I'm really into self-sufficiency. I want to be able to produce as much as I possibly can on my own tiny little quarter acre and be able to generate those nutrients in-house rather than going out and having to buy them, haul them around, all that sort of thing. It's really just, I don't want to rely on somebody else for what's really a very basic component of any gardener's set of skills, one of those being to produce nutrients on your own property. Okay, I'm going forward through time for a couple of hours just because there's one important benefit of weed water that I forgot to mention. I hate weeding. I hate it so much. If there is a hell for gardeners, there's probably a lot of weeding going on there. And for years, it's always felt to me like just this tremendous waste of time. It's this pointless Sisyphean chore that you keep doing, and there just doesn't seem to be a huge benefit. But since beginning to use weed water, my perspective on weeding has changed. I see weeding now, instead of being this awful drudgery, to more of a sense of harvesting, that when I'm out there picking weeds, I'm not just fighting this unstoppable force that's encroaching on my garden. I'm reclaiming nutrients. I'm extracting nutrients from these weeds that would otherwise just be lost. So I go out and I weed, and I'm really killing two birds with one stone. One, you're getting rid of these pest plants that you don't want in your garden, and two, you're getting nutrients out of it. So when you change your perspective of weeding a little bit from being either just a terrible chore you have to do or something where you can get something out of it, it makes it a little bit easier to actually get out there and do the weeding in the first place. Okay, let's go back in time and continue. And before you jump down my throat, no, this is not compost tea. It's completely different. In compost tea, you take pre-decomposed compost, mix it with water, and then apply that solution to your plants. In what I'm doing with weed water, you're taking fresh green vegetation that has not been decomposed yet. You're letting it decompose in this anaerobic watery solution, and what you get is weed water. It is not compost tea. Totally different thing. And it doesn't take any fancy equipment. It doesn't take any scientific knowledge. It doesn't take any really specific conditions. It's absolutely idiot proof, which is perfect for me. I can produce it at scale. It's really easy to scale this up. I am now producing 35-gallon batches at a time. So over the course of this past summer, I produced probably hundreds of gallons of this stuff. And I also started testing it to figure out what is in it. So I'm going to talk to you about how do you make this stuff, what do you need to make it, and what do you need to do? What have I found out about it? What are major conclusions that I've come up with? And I'll also show you my data and my testing methods that I used to figure out what is in weed water. So how do you make weed water? It really cannot be any simpler than what the stuff is. All that you need is a waterproof container, like a big bucket or something with a lid. This tiny little thing is just for demonstration. Pack it to the brim with fresh green weeds or waste vegetation, as long as it's herbaceous, so you really can't use woody stuff. This could be grass clippings, this could be dandelions or any other weeds that you have growing around your property. Just stuff them to the brim in that bucket, and then fill it with water. You can use rainwater, you can use tap water, city water, you can use ditch water, you can use whatever you want. Fill it up to the brim so that those weeds are nice and covered with water, and then take your lid, set it on. You don't have to snug it on. I mean, it doesn't have to be airtight. It really shouldn't be airtight, but you just put your lid on and then walk away from it. I stir my weed water every maybe 2 days, a day or two, just to make sure that the weeds that are on top get incorporated down into the bottom of the mixture. What is going on when you're submerging these weeds in water is a few things. One thing is that it kills the weeds really fast. It only takes a day or two to kill the weeds, whereas if you take a weed and throw it out on your yard, it can survive for a few days, especially if it's rainy or if it's really humid. And then, in particular, in the case with like dandelions, it can still bloom, set seed, and then those seeds go all over the place. And so by ripping weeds out, you might actually be helping their spread. So by dunking your weeds into water and killing them right away, that kind of prevents that, especially for something like dandelions. The other thing that is going on here is that any seeds that are in the weeds are being killed. If you submerge the seed of a terrestrial plant in water, it eventually suffocates it, because for a weed to germinate and start growing, it needs oxygen. Probably even more importantly than all those things is that the nutrients that are present in those weeds, so the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, and other nutrients that are all present in the tissues of those green herbaceous weeds, are leaching out of those tissues into the surrounding solution. It's really a controlled fermentation. It's not that different than what you would do to make sauerkraut. You take your fresh stuff, submerge it under a brine, really, and that begins cooking. You get all this bacterial fermentation. It bubbles, right? You'll notice there's bubbles kind of coming out of the solution. It has a very rank odor. It's pretty stinky. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And just give it a couple of weeks. For me, it's 3 weeks about is my good number. But you could go less. You could do just 1 or 2 weeks if you want. You could go longer. The nutrients persist in this solution for a couple of months. So you're really not losing any nutrients over time, even if you let them sit. So I've got, a 35 gallons of this stuff, actually more, probably closer to 50 gallons, sitting outside by my garage, and it's the middle of winter. So I can really get a jump start on this in the springtime, because I already have loads of weed water ready to go. Once fermentation begins to slow down, you'll notice your bucket's not bubbling as much, and also the rate of decomposition in the weeds, you'll notice it starts to slow down. They turn brown and squishy, and then they reach the certain point where they're not changing that much day to day. That's probably the point at which you've reached that maximum fermentation. As much nutrients as you can pull out of those weeds has been pulled out into that solution, and you're ready to now apply it to your crops. What I then do if I want to apply it to my garden, I remove the solids, the weeds, the leaves, and all the solid stuff that's in there. I remove that. You can use a strainer, or you can just reach in with gloves and just pull that stuff out. And you're left with this incredibly nutrient-rich solution. And there's tons of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in it, and I'll share those numbers with you in a moment. You can apply that liquid to your plants directly. If you're nervous about using it, you can dilute it with maybe a 1-to-1 with water. So you can take, a gallon of weed water, mix it with a gallon of water, and you can apply that to your crops. I will caution you against using this on leafy vegetables. So things like lettuce or chard or spinach, anything whose leaves you're going to eat directly, because weed water does have an odor. If you've ever smelled fermenting sauerkraut, right? It's a very strong fermenting odor. You're going to get something a little bit like that with weed water. It's much, much stronger because there's a huge fermentation going on with bacteria, in particular Clostridium, which those are bacteria that are responsible for the decomposition of a variety of macromolecules in those weeds. So it's not pleasant smelling. So you wouldn't want to put this on crops where you're going to eat that leafy vegetable directly. I have used this extensively with beets and potatoes, and I've found that the taste of the weed water does not incorporate itself into the tissues of the plant that you're growing, only on the outside. So I would never use this on lettuce, chard, spinach, any kind of leafy green that you're going to eat, because it smells really funky, and I'm willing to bet that it tastes really funky too. And then just watch your plants grow crazy. This stuff is such a big boost to my plants and filling my nutrient gaps that I'm never going back. I will never buy synthetic fertilizer again. And you also can't kill your plants with this. It doesn't reach levels of NPK that are toxic, at least not in my experience with using it. And so you can't really over apply it. I mean, you can use what you want. If you notice your plants are responding badly, hold back a little bit. But it's great, 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 great stuff. The solids can also be used as a mulch. I use the leftover solid bits from the weeds as a mulch around my fruit trees, and it retains moisture pretty well, and paradoxically enough, it actually suppresses the growth of weeds, even though it's this high nutrient, stuff. It almost acts a little bit like wood chips. Like, it just doesn't let light through, and the weeds can't get through. So I've got these sort of rings of weed water solids around all my fruit trees, and I think my fruit trees appreciate the little boost of nutrients that they get from that, but also just keeps the weeds down, it keeps the moisture up, and the trees seem to enjoy it. So over the course of this past summer, I really dove headfirst into my exploration of weed water and kind of fiddling with different recipes and measuring the nutrient output, what is present in that solution in terms of the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that it generates. So I'll go through a little bit of those major conclusions with you, and I'll also show you how I tested my weed water and figured out what is present in it. So after all this testing, the first conclusion that I came to is that your inputs, the weeds that you put into the weed water, do have some impact on the nutrient solution that is produced. Maybe not in the way that I expected it to, but certainly there was some kind of relationship between what you put in and what you got out, as you would expect. In general, if you want a well-balanced weed water solution, which if you're a home gardener, probably you do, the best thing to do is to use a mix of a variety of weeds. Use dandelions, use some grasses, use waste vegetation, your beet clippings, and any plants that you grow and you throw out bits of those plants, stems and leaves and things. Use that in weed water, because you're trying to circularize your garden's nutrient economy. You're trying to, any kind of output, even if it's a waste output, should become an input for another system. It's a really basic principle of self-sufficiency and permaculture, is this idea that any output should also be an input. So use those waste products as long as they're green and herbaceous, but it should be a mix. So I experimented with a few different mixes, a few solutions. So a few buckets I filled up just purely with dandelions, and I looked to see what that nutrient composition was. I also did buckets that were just grasses. So these are individuals of the genus Poa, so any weeds that would qualify as a true grass. I also did clover. I also used waste vegetation from amaranth. It's a grain, just the leaves and the spare stalks and all the stuff that I had left over. I made weed water out of that as well. And then I also did buckets where I just did mixes of weeds. And then these mixes of weeds, I wasn't really recording exactly which species or which groups of weeds I was putting in. I was just going around my garden, just plucking up any weeds that I found, stuffing them into these buckets. I found that in the buckets where I stuffed mixes of a variety of different weeds, my weed water was better balanced. So I got roughly equal ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which is probably what you want. And that was the case in all of my mixes, even one that I actually let sit over the winter, so that mix was 8 months old. It was actually better balanced than a lot of my fresher stuff that had just these specific pure combinations of weeds. So what I found in terms of the composition was that amaranth, clover, and grasses, when isolated, when kept in their own buckets, produced a huge amount of phosphorus and relatively smaller amounts of nitrogen and potassium. You might want that. You might say, gee, I tested my soil and it's low in phosphate. So you could go ahead and you could use grasses, clover, or amaranth clippings, and you could actually end up with a pretty phosphorus-rich solution. Dandelion was a little lower in phosphorus. It was a little bit better balanced than grasses, clover, and amaranth. So you just get a better rounded nutrient mix by using a mix of weeds. So sort of makes sense. Another major conclusion that I came up with from all this extensive testing that I did is that the nitrogen that's produced in weed water is ammonia. It's not nitrate. So when you go to buy a balanced 10-10-10, fertilizer from, the garden store, the hardware store, whatever, that N on the NPK is likely in the form of nitrate, so that's NO3. Nitrate is nitrogen that has been oxidized. But in my weed water solutions, the only nitrogen stuff that I measured was ammonia, which means that the nitrogen was reduced instead of oxidized. That hints to me that this process is probably anaerobic, that this fermentation that's going on in the bucket, it's not dependent on oxygen, it's probably anaerobic. And then finally, my last major conclusion to walk away with is that that ammonia level peaks between 2 and 4 weeks. So I was not only testing these solutions, just once to see what was in it, I would actually take the same bucket and test it a few times over the course of several weeks just to see how those nutrients changed with time. So what I would see in some of these buckets is a gradual increase in the amount of nitrogen for the first 2 or 3 weeks. And then after about that fourth week, you start seeing a decline in the nitrogen because the ammonia is volatile. It's evaporating away. So if you want the maximum nitrogen that you're going to get out of that weed water, probably apply it at about 3 weeks. As far as another supposition here, and sort of dovetails with the whole anaerobic nature of this fermentation, weed water stinks. It smells tremendously bad. That's how you know it's working, is that it stinks really bad. So as these weeds are rotting and decomposing in this water, bacteria are blooming. They're going crazy. One of these groups of bacteria is probably lactobacillus. So lactobacillus is used in sour pickles, sauerkraut, kimchi, any fermented vegetable that you eat, it's probably lactobacillus. However, we're out in nature, it's a messy situation. It's not just lactobacillus that you're going to find in these buckets of weed water. There's all kinds of natural soil bacteria and bacteria that were present on the plants that suddenly start growing because they've got all this food that they're munching away on. One of those is probably Clostridium. Clostridium are a group of bacteria that are partly responsible for the process of what's called putrefaction. So putrefaction is when natural tissues, materials, whether animal or plant, decompose and produce some really noxious odors, scatols and putrescine and all kinds of nasty compounds that just smell very rank and really, really gross. That probably wouldn't happen if this were an aerobic process. So when you produce compost properly, the reason why you're always stirring and turning all that compost is so that you get a lot of oxygen into that mixture and you promote aerobic decomposition. And so well decomposed compost, which is decomposed aerobically, has a sweet smell, earthy smell. It smells good. This stuff does not. And so that's why I cautioned you at the beginning. Don't use this on leafy vegetables. Don't let it come in direct contact with anything that you're going to eat just because it smells so bad. So kind of further evidence that what's probably going on is anaerobic respiration and not aerobic. Finally, in terms of suppositions, I calculated that if you use a 30 to 35 gallon batch of this weed water, you're probably going to end up with the nutrient equivalent of maybe 2 pounds of well-balanced synthetic fertilizer. That is, if you were to take all that weed water and let's say evaporate away all the water and until you just had the solids, what would be left? Maybe about 2 pounds of fertilizer that you buy from the store. And for your reference, if you'd like to see what those ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are for these various solutions, I'm going to display that right here. So at this point, let's go into the lab and I'll show you exactly how I tested this stuff. So now let me actually show you what tests I did to analyze my weed water, and I'll actually perform each test so that you can see what those results look like. Okay, so I've got a sample of filtered weed water. This is some late season weed water that I did toward the end of the season. I filtered it with just a little lab filter here. I could have used a coffee filter or something like that. Well, the very first thing that I would always do is use a generic aquarium test kit. This has 9 different tests in it. It tests for iron, copper, nitrate, nitrite, chlorine, hardness, alkalinity, carbonate, and pH. So it gives a good, well-rounded idea of what is in the weed water. And that doesn't require dilution. I usually used the weed water straight out of the barrel to do that. And when I used the rest of these tests, I diluted the weed water down to about 1% because most of them are pretty low range. So after my 9-in-1 aquarium test, I would test for phosphate. Again, it's just an aquarium kit. It gives me a sense of how much phosphorus is in the weed water. The next thing I would try is nitrate, a nitrate test. I will tell you, I never got anything for nitrate. Lots of nitrogen in the weed water, I could tell because it made plants grow like crazy, but the nitrogen was not in the form of nitrate. That took me a while to figure out. The next test that I would run is an ammonia and ammonium test. This got me some really good results for nitrogen. It actually started showing me how much nitrogen was in the weed water. And then the last test that I did was a potassium test. I will say this is the least scientific test that I did because it was really meant for soil. So Rapid Test sells these. They're pretty famous. You can find them at a hardware store or gardening store. And potassium always gave me good results. So I'm not really concerned about the fact that it's a soil test instead of a water test. It always gave me really high results no matter how I used it. All right, now let me just go ahead and run each of these tests so I can show you what the results look like. The aquarium test is the easiest one to do. I'm just gonna pop that guy open, pull out one of these test strips. So here's one of my test strips. I've got this little vial, and I'm just gonna place enough undiluted weed water into this vial so that the test strip can submerge entirely within it. So I'm gonna grab a pipette. The instructions require that you dip this strip into the solution for exactly 2 seconds. So that's what I'm going to do. Okay, ready? 1, 2, there we go, set it down. All right, so after waiting a few seconds, I'm going to compare the test strip against the values that are on the side of the bottle. And so we can see my iron is low, my copper is low, my nitrate and nitrite are low, chlorine is low, hardness is up there pretty good. That's probably between 150 and 300. Alkalinity is also pretty high, that looks like 180 to me. Carbonate is also pretty high, maybe 120. And my pH is on the basic side, that's probably somewhere around 8. So this is a really quick and easy, just sort of baseline way to figure out what sorts of stuff are in my weed water. I know there's basically no nitrate or nitrite in it based on this, but there's plenty of dissolved salts because of that hardness, alkalinity, and carbonate. So I'll set that aside. So these next few tests are a little bit more involved because they are low range tests. I can't use the undiluted weed water to test them. I have to actually dilute that to about a 1% solution so that I can use these low range tests. So to do that, I'm going to take a 100 milliliter volumetric flask and I'm going to put 1 milliliter of weed water into that, and I'll fill it the rest of the way up with distilled water, and that will give me a 1% solution that I can use my other tests with. So I've actually found that the easiest way to do this is to take a small graduated cylinder and fill it up with 9 milliliters of water, and then just add that last 1 milliliter with concentrated weed water. There we go. I'm going to take that, put it into my volumetric flask, rinse it out with some more distilled water. Now that I've got my 1 milliliter of undiluted weed water in there, I'll fill it up all the way exactly to 100, as close to that line on the neck as I can get. There we go. So that's 100 mils. And I'm gonna go ahead and give that a mix. So that is my 1% solution of weed water. And from here, I can do the rest of these tests. Okay, so the first test I'm going to do right now is phosphate. To show you what that test looks like. It's a 2-part test, so it has these 2 chemicals. A little vial there, and it has a card against which you can compare the color. Okay, so I'm going to take my solution of 1% diluted weed water, and I'm going to fill up my little testing vial here. I need 5 milliliters, and I'm going to use bottle 1 and add 6 drops. For both of these, I give them a really good shake. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Almost got away from me. Give that a really good shake for about 5 seconds. And I need 6 more drops from bottle 2. This one also requires a vigorous shaking because the solution is thick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah, it's like syrup. All right, cap that. Give it a shake. So I could let that sit for the required 3 minutes, and I do. But you can see that that's at least 2 parts per million phosphate. It might actually darken all the way to 5 parts per million. But remember, that's in my diluted weed water. So if I want to know what concentration my original weed water has, I'd have to multiply this by 100. So let's say that comes out to 5 parts per million, which is looking like it probably will. That's actually going to come out to 500 parts per million, if you follow my meaning. Okay, so that's phosphate. Let's now test for nitrogen. So I mentioned that in the past I was trying to use these to test for nitrates. I'm not actually going to run that test right now because it always comes up negative. For my money, I would say it's not worth testing for nitrate. Instead, what it gives you is ammonia. This particular ammonia kit, I love it. It's really quick results and it's easy to read, very importantly. So this is another two-stage test. You can see I've got bottle 1 and bottle 2. So once again, I need 5 milliliters of my diluted weed water. So this is 1%. And I'm going to put in 4 drops of reagent 1 and give that a swirl. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Swirl that up. Reagent 2, another 4 drops. 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'll give that a swirl. So I'm actually going to walk away for about 3 minutes and come back, and we'll see what that looks like. All right, so that was 3 or 4 minutes, and to me it looks like that's about a 2. So 2 parts per million ammonia in my 1% diluted weed water. That means that the undiluted weed water had an ammonia concentration of about 200 parts per million. So I'll set that aside. The last test that I'll do with you here is the potassium test. So this is the test that's made by Repitest. These are really for soil testing. And so this is the one I trust the least because it's really not meant for water, it's meant for soil. But it's really easy to do. All that I need to do is to take this little capsule, and I like to just break it in half right on top of the testing chamber. Let that powder fall in there. Now I'm gonna take my weed water. I like to fill this one up about halfway and then give it a really good shake because that powder really sort of resists dissolving. So fill it up halfway, give it a good shake. Okay, that kind of mixes it in. Now I'll fill that up the rest of the way here. This is another test that actually takes a few minutes to develop, so this one's about a 5-minute wait. So let that sit and let that color develop. Okay, so I've let this test develop for around 10 minutes, and we're gonna take a glance at the color here. So to me, it looks like the color in the test chamber is pretty close to what it reads as adequate. And remember, this is the 1% diluted weed water. So if it's saying that this number is adequate, multiply adequate by 100 times, and that's what we have in the weed water. For the life of me, I could not figure out how to translate this test into a parts per million for potassium. It's why it's my least trusted test, the one that I consider the least scientific. However, Repitest is telling me there's potassium in the weed water, and it says it's a pretty decent amount. And so, because I used a diluted sample, it's an appreciable amount of potassium that's present in the weed water, even though I cannot figure out how to turn that into a concentration. And I crawled all over chemical supply companies looking for tests to accurately measure potassium, and I cannot, for the life of me, figure out where they are. I'm guessing because potassium is easily confused with sodium. They're very similar ions, and so it's probably pretty difficult to have a good analytical test to distinguish between those 2 ions. In any case, we can see that my weed water has a pretty decent amount of potassium in it. So those were the tests that I used to figure out what nutrients were in my weed water.